Okay, so welcome everyone to the class on the profound treasury, the path of indestructible, the tantric path of indestructible wakefulness. Um, John is meeting with his teacher, an online program with his teacher tonight, so he won't be with us. And we're going to be talking about the chapter titled Introduction to the Vajrayana in this text tonight. Again, each of these books, each of the Profound Treasury books, are based on a compendium of the seminaries that Trungpa Rinpoche did from 1972 through 1986. There were 13 in all. Um, and what the editors have done is to pull together chapters and talks on themes that were presented throughout these seminaries. So there's actually an appendix in the back of the book that shows which seminary talks are contribute to each chapter. This particular one actually includes 16 different talks. So there were in each seminary, there was an introductory talk when he began the Vajrayana section. And there were certain themes, I think, that are fairly consistent through these talks, particularly the importance of the three yana journey, the notion of lineage and respect for these teachings, and some idea of history as well as his own personal experiences of the Vajrayana. So each seminary, which is a 3-month program, included a month of the Hinayana, 2 weeks of sitting practice and 2 weeks of study, talks by Trungpa Rinpoche as well as by other teachers, 2 weeks of sitting and 2 weeks of study, the Mahayana teachings, and then finally in the last month, the Vajrayana. And so the chapter tonight is really a compendium of all of the different talks that in which he introduced the Vajrayana teachings. So Vajra is a word that means indestructible or diamond-like. So whereas Hinayana is sometimes translated as narrow or lesser vehicle, although many teachers now prefer to call it the foundational vehicle. Mahayana is the greater vehicle. The Vajrayana is the indestructible vehicle, diamond-like, diamond ship, he sometimes called it. So he begins by talking about presenting the Vajrayana and says that we're really just introducing the theory of Vajrayana. So, and he says that in Vajrayana or Tantra, a theoretical or intellectual understanding should act as the vanguard. This is interesting because not too much further into the talk, he will be sharing how experiential this is. But the point is that a great deal of the Vajrayana really relates to our ability to recognize our true nature. And so having an idea, having some understanding of what's being pointed out to us, what we're discovering about ourselves, what we're cultivating within ourselves is really important. As he says, these are elaborate and powerful teachings, and it's important to know where we're going and what we're going to do so far as the practice is concerned. So although we'll be beginning with throughout this text, developing a theoretical understanding of what we're working with, working toward, working to understand. In the end, what happens with the Vajrayana is we drop concepts and recognize, just simply relax into, enter into some understanding. And he compares the having some understanding before we begin to like a trip to the North Pole. So we have some idea of what we're getting into. He says, for instance, you'd know if you were going to the North Pole that you should bring warm clothes. So in this case, also, he says that we're learning something about the preciousness of the Vajrayana. And this will come up again later in this chapter, where he really talks about the importance of appreciating the value of what we're learning. And then he says there's a word of warning, not to expect words of wisdom, that some of what we have to talk about might be very ordinary things, but that most importantly, it's something that he himself has experienced, and therefore we could experience as well. Whether it's up to our expectations or not is up to us, but he is telling us what he's experienced, that it's not although we're approaching it from the point of view of developing some conceptual understanding of what we're getting into, ultimately it is something that can be experienced directly. And he says, we might feel that it's complete hype or exaggeration. We might feel it's the real thing. We could experience trust or distrust when truth is told and might have doubts. But he says there's a difference between doubt and distrust. That distrust is condemning the whole thing, whereas doubt is knowing something is happening, but not knowing exactly what's going on. And if your experience of the Vajrayana is anything like mine, that is what we'll experience. Have some idea that something's happening, but not always sure exactly what's going on. But the distrust condemning the whole thing, that becomes a problem. And I think toward the end of this chapter, he spends a fair amount of time talking about the history and lineage of the Vajrayana. And I think part of that is to help dispel some of our, some potential distrust. In any case, he says that when we experience doubt, it provides us with the possibility of questioning ourselves and whether we have the faculties and capability to understand the Vajrayana. So doubt may be useful to us as part of the path as we try to work and understand, so long as we're not dealing with that level of doubt where we doubt our capabilities altogether, which really falls more into distrust. And he says also that when it came time to present his teachings, that he thought about his own teacher, Jamgon Kongtrul, and cried. But then realized there was no point in living in the past, that whatever sense of trust or distrust are here with him right now. And that he thought about how his teacher and how His Holiness the Karmapa would like to hear him expound the Dharma. And he felt from this there was a natural confirmation that took place. So he says, he'll be speaking from his heart, not too methodically or scholarly. So that's the contrast to the beginning where he talks about the theoretical, that the experiential is also important. And the purpose of the theoretical is to help us recognize the experiential. So he says, we're talking about something real, something personally experienced. He also says it's impossible to present Vajrayana in its fullest sense. That's certainly true. But it says, it's interesting statements. If there's enough confusion, Hinayana can be presented. If there's enough confusion about benevolence, love, and religiosity, Mahayana can be presented. But nobody could be crazy enough to present or listen to the Vajrayana. But nonetheless, society has gone crazy. Confusions exist everywhere. And spiritual disciplines have gotten corrupted. And because of that, it's become possible to present the Vajrayana. So again, this particular chapter is derived from several different seminary talks. I particularly recognize the section about his teacher, Jamgon Kongtrul, is coming from the very first seminary in 1973, where he talked about when he first presented the Vajrayana teachings. But I think some of his comments about the social situation, what he encountered in the United States with spiritual materialism and spiritual shopping, that kind of ferment made possible perhaps that the Vajrayana could be presented. As for the confusion about the Hinayana, I think what we're talking about there is our ability to recognize our confusion and therefore be open to our need to practice or the value of practice, or at least some curiosity about practice and study, that it's through recognizing our confusion, both on the Hinayana level, as well as with the Mahayana teachings, that creates some openness. And with that, he begins talking about establishing a strong foundation. As I said, I think in many of his introductory Vajrayana talks, the importance of understanding the three yana journey and the importance of appreciating and working with all of the yanas was something that he stressed over and over again. So he begins by saying that we need the foundations of Hinayana discipline and Mahayana benevolence. And in particular, with the Hinayana, we begin with simple shamatha practice, mindfulness practice, and vipassana, awareness practice. That we're able, and out of that, we learn to synchronize mind and body, so that we actually can begin to pay some attention to our experience and begin to realize, recognize things in our experience. For instance, how moods and feelings are in constant flux, how what we believe to be so seriously true in one moment seems dreamlike in the next, how when we're not paying attention to our experience, how we end up doing things that harm ourselves or harm others. And that's exactly what he says. The point of Hinayana discipline, the point is to make sure we're not hurting ourselves or others. And we come to do this, again, through mindfulness awareness practice, shamatha vipassana practice, where we learn to slow down, synchronize mind and body, and actually pay attention to our experience, pay attention to our mind, pay attention to what we're doing, and begin to live in a different way. And he says this is based on recognizing our confusion with Hinayana, development of Hinayana discipline, recognizing our confusion, recognizing our suffering, and wanting to end it. And the importance of recognizing our confusion is oftentimes what people do is seek some kind of comfort, security, some kind of happiness from external things. You know, if I only had this possession, if I only had this experience, if I only had this person in my life, or we externalize the blame for our pain and suffering in such a way that we don't learn from what we're doing. We don't learn from our mistakes. We just perpetuate things, our karma over and over again. So when we come to recognize our own confusion, what we're actually doing is facing ourselves and facing our experience. And this is the important part of the Hinayana discipline, that it's through Hinayana discipline that we have become tamed. It says the Hinayana discipline of shamatha actually tames individuals and creates an environment of discipline. So this is one important part of the foundation for Vajrayana practice. It's having some fundamental discipline so that we're not under the constant sway and illusion of the kleshas. We're not just driven from moment to moment by moods and karmic tendencies and habitual tendencies of all kinds. But we actually have some stability and some ability to begin to recognize what our experience actually is. And then he says, with that foundation, we move into the Mahayana. We take the Bodhisattva vow. We begin to realize the suffering of others. And there are a lot of different routes to experiencing this recognition of the suffering of others. But probably, you know, one of the most important ones is that as we begin to see through our own confusion, we begin to recognize that others suffer in exactly the same way. So there's a shifting of gears, he says. We shift from self-help to helping others, or at least opening to others. We at least have the intention to be helpful. He says, with this, our attitude begins to change, and we develop an understanding of the Mahayana principle of exchanging self for other, or as he put it in the one of the Mahayana talks that we read, that we're no longer look just for ourselves. We no longer are thinking just about me, but begin to consider others in a different way. And part of this also is the lojong practice, the slogan practice, and that we learn we can actually send out, give up our pleasure and take in the pain and suffering of others because we're holding less tightly to our sense of self. Ultimately, what makes that possible is the experience of egolessness, that we realize that there's nothing we're really taking anything into. But in the beginning, it's just at least as he says, at least we're opening to others. And with this, he says, we have the possibilities of becoming decent Vajrayana people because we have this capability to do such a thing, exchange self for other, put others before ourselves. That we develop twofold bodhicitta, or awakened heart. This includes both the compassionate, soft, and gentle mind of relative bodhicitta. And with ultimate bodhicitta, we learn to rest in the nature of the basic goodness of Alaya. We begin to be able to rest in our inherent Buddha nature, our Tathagata Garbha. And he says, with this, we develop wakefulness, lessening of ego fixation and grasping. So this is the strong foundation that we're building. The more we do this, he says, more we're able to exchange self for other, let go of fixation on ourselves and our points of view and our needs and demands. The more we're able to do this, the more we become decent human beings, so that we become decent candidates for enlightenment. And he says that exchanging self for others is an extraordinary step, that we become softer, more genuine people. And with that merit, we become worthy of the Vajrayana. So this is the foundation that Vajrayana practice is built on. He says if we're in terms of merit, I think that the next thing that he says actually really clarifies what this means. He says if we're unable to hear the higher teachings of the Vajrayana, it's because we become deaf and dumb. We have no way of stepping out of our discursive thoughts, no way of stepping out of ego fixation and grasping, because we're caught up in our preoccupation with ourselves. So the kind of merit that he's talking about, at least one aspect of it, is developing enough clarity and discipline that we're not deaf and dumb, that we're able to let go of ego fixation and grasping, and we're able to let go of discursive thoughts and actually pay attention to ourselves and to others. And that this is the merit that makes it possible for us to hear the Vajrayana as well. And as he says, as we come to understand the value of what we're practicing and studying, the value of Lojong, we begin to see how brave we've become as well. And that because of that bravery, when conflicting motions, passion, aggression, and ignorance, and discursive thoughts arise, we regard them as ripples on the pond. Ripples on the pond. The pond itself is not disturbed, it remains clear and pure. And he says we realize this because we understand our intrinsic Tathagata Garbha, or Buddha nature. So what's happening there is we're beginning to experience the change of allegiance that John sometimes talked about, that we begin to understand that whatever kleshas come up, whatever discursive thoughts come up, that they're just on the surface of our mind. They're like, again, ripples or waves on the pond, but that the pond itself is actually the big mind, that what we're no longer identifying so much with the little mind and the projections and dramas that little mind creates, but we're able to keep in mind a big mind, our greater experience of awareness, our greater experience of Tathagata Garbha, so that there's a real change in how we see ourselves and how we see the world. And with this, we can give to others and build a strong foundation for ourselves at the same time. So in the Vajrayana, we learn to respect the world. It's not an evil world, but a sacred world. He says we develop sacred outlook and receive transmission. And from that, we develop a sense of how we could actually perceive phenomena without trying to perceive. We realize how we could appreciate phenomena instantly without a struggle. So I'll say that again. We could actually perceive phenomena without trying to perceive. We realize how we could appreciate phenomena instantly without a struggle. So we're talking here very similarly to what we talked about in the Shambhala text, in the sections on Drala and Cosmic Mirror, that we have the possibility for direct perception, direct experience, perception without labeling, judging, deciding what's for me, what's against me, what I like, what I don't like. And with that, we're able to expand into the vastness of perception and the freshness of perception. And this comes out of this foundation of Hinayana and Mahayana practice, but is developed fully in the Vajrayana. He says the Vajrayana journey is short and concentrated, but we don't bypass the Hinayana and Mahayana. We constantly go back and forth. And this is a theme that will come up throughout this chapter, and I would not be surprised that, or you should not be surprised, I should say, to see it come up again in the chapters that we'll be reading later. That he'll come back again and again to the importance of the Hinayana and Mahayana experience. He says, we constantly go back and forth. We keep trying to understand ourselves by realizing the gentleness of shamatha, the wakefulness of vipassana, the reasonableness of lojong, and the greater warriorship of the bodhisattva path. So as he will say later, it's not that we graduate from the previous yanas. One teacher used the analogy of a rope with three strands that are twisted together to make the rope strong. That it's not that we leave the Hinayana, but our vision is expanded. So we keep trying to understand ourselves by realizing the gentleness of shamatha, the wakefulness of vipassana, the reasonableness of lojong, and the warriorship of the bodhisattva path. And he says, beyond that, we have to surrender ourselves to the intoxication of Vajrayana. But he points out we can't make ourselves intoxicated. That leads to spiritual materialism, trying to create an experience, trying to create a state of mind, or grasping a state of mind that we might experience. He says it has to happen spontaneously. And with this, he goes into a number of analogies and metaphors to talk about the three yanas and the journey that we go through. There's the gorilla. There's one with the gorilla. There's the mirror. There's planting a field and building a house. And as with any analogy or metaphor, they can be understood in different ways. And I will share some of my understanding, but when it comes time for questions and answers tonight or tomorrow, it'd be great to hear what other people, how other people resonated with some of these metaphors. I think the first one was the gorilla, which really emphasized, although he talks about three yanas in this, it really emphasizes the taming aspect of the path, the taming aspect of the three yanas. He begins by saying, without taming, we can't tame ourselves, that we're somewhat wild and untamable. So he says, we traditionally, we'd catch you and put you in a zoo, which is monasticism, but actually you walk into our trap. Interesting way to put it. But the best thing we can do is educate and civilize the gorilla. So shamatha tames the gorilla and creates an environment of discipline. This allows the gorilla to develop a more civilized nature. We take the gorilla for walks so they develop more awareness of others and a quality of gentleness. To help the gorilla develop good table manners so that it can be gentle, hospitable, and kind. So here we're talking about the Mahayana, although you can also see some, some of the reflection of some of the Shambhala teachings as well, and the emphasis on just basic discipline, basic manners, just how we conduct ourselves. And then finally, we take the gorilla on a further journey based on the training it's already realized. And with this journey, its gorilla nature could begin to come out. And this is really more the Vajrayana. Again, coming to realize our true nature, our primordial nature, very much like talking about the discovery of basic goodness and and the full realization, full identification with basic goodness that we talked about in the Shambhala text. And with that, we let the gorilla out in the jungle, let it loose to resume its own habitual patterns and style of relating with the world. And then the gorilla could begin to teach other gorillas and monkeys. But he does say there's a possibility it could slip back, and that's why the Vajrayana is tricky and special. The Vajrayana tells you how to be yourself, but at the same time, it tells you how not to be yourself, which is an interesting statement that perhaps and it will come up again in this chapter, how to be yourself and how not to be yourself. I suppose one way to talk about that would be to say that how to be ourselves relates to being able to tune into or fully realize our enlightened nature, our basic wakefulness, our awareness. And not being ourselves is not getting caught up in our habitual patterns and usual ego-driven ways of being in the world. It goes on to talk about the three yana journey, and again says that we're not graduating from Hinayana to Mahayana, and actually introduces another little metaphor here of a professor who, even if they have a PhD, still needs to know how to spell words on the 6th grade level. So again, he says we need to keep going back to square one. And this is again, as he said previously, that we go back and forth between the yanas. But he says in the Vajrayana, we want to liberate all and everything. But to be ready, we need to become an excellent practitioner. We need to have an understanding of the journey, the fruition, as well as the ground. And then he introduces the analogy of a mirror. He says in the Hinayana stage, we're working to free the mirror of dust. This is the taming. This is the settling and the development, the recognition and development of awareness through shamatha and vipassana practice. In the Mahayana, we're working to keep dust from landing on the mirror. In particular, the Mahayana works on letting go of ego fixation, letting go of putting ourselves first or thinking only of ourselves, and beginning to open up to to others with compassion and open to the world with compassion and friendliness. So in that way, we keep dust from landing on the mirror. And at the Vajrayana level, we look directly into the mirror. We're directly experiencing our true nature. And we see that it's alpha pure, primordially pure, right from the beginning, not pure as opposed to dirty, which is again very much like how we talked about the cosmic mirror in the Shambhala teachings. We see that it's basic goodness, which does not mean that we're bad and now you found something good, but it's just a natural quality of being. Again, it's primordial. It's our first thought, before or even before thought, just our basic fundamental awake mind. And he says this naturalist means we have nothing to dilute or delete. We just remain as what you are, but perhaps begin to recognize it for the first time. But nothing to dilute or delete. He says, he uses another metaphor that the three yana journey is like planting a field, sowing seeds, letting the crops grow, harvesting it, and then turning it into a product of some kind, jelly, jam, he says. He says that we have to harvest. It's interesting. He says we have to harvest ourselves. We have to be cut out of the ground. But this process is not regarded as sabotage or killing. We have to cut you from the earth and make you spacebound. We make use of you, make jams and pies. And again, I think each of these metaphors could see having different meanings. But one thing I would say about this metaphor of planting a field is that on the one hand, it's something completely organic that grows in the way that it's supposed to grow. But at the same time, there is some effort. We do cultivate. We bring out, but in our cultivating, we're not putting anything there other than what's naturally there. So we're not creating something, we're allowing something to be what it actually is fully, which is essentially our true nature, our fundamental awareness. The next metaphor that he talks about is the golden roof, where he talks about the three yana journey as being like building a house. Says the Hinayana is the starting point, the foundation. With the Mahayana, we discover our enlightened potential, the reality of Buddha nature, which is like putting up walls. And then we're concerned with making the house livable with a ceiling and roof. So there's a Vajrayana roof of gold. And he says the Vajrayana is the golden roof because it's the final procedure through which we become accomplished. It's not the fruition, but the beginning of the fruition. But it does point out the connection between Hinayana, but also Mahayana and Vajrayana in an interesting way. There's actually, with the Mahayana, we look at our nature as like a Buddha essence or Buddha nature, whereas with the Vajrayana, we're actually discovering the full capability of our enlightened potential, so that it's not gold hidden underground, which is a metaphor used in the Mahayana, that the metaphor is of a poor person who doesn't realize that he's underneath where he's sleeping. There's a pot of gold, but he doesn't realize that that's there. And that's used as a metaphor for discovering our Buddha nature and discovering the richness that's hidden within us. But in this case, it's the roof. It's visible and we can see it. And it's fully there. So it's not hidden in any way. It's fully manifested. And that's one way of understanding something of the Vajrayana. As he says, fundamentally, and this goes back to the notion of beginning of fruition, but it is the fruition, that fundamentally we start with Vajra mind, our inherent intelligence, and that keeps growing constantly in our environment through our training. So again, whether we think of the analogy of the planting a field, building a house, what we're talking about is in the Vajrayana, we fully recognize, fully live with, fully are in tune with our enlightened nature. So we begin the three on a journey by establishing a basic footing. From there, he says, we evolve further, which is like putting up walls. And finally, the finishing touch, which is the roof. It says, when the building is complete, it could connect us with the natural environment around us. It's an ideal state of existence to be involved in. This state of existence is based on discriminating awareness wisdom, not on a conceptual notion of what should be happening. So this is the state of existence that we're talking about at this point, based on discriminating awareness wisdom, fully developed, fully expressing discriminating awareness wisdom, not an idea, not a conceptual notion, not some ideal that we imagine, but our in the moment experience of awareness. He compares this to simple things like just knowing that with the change of seasons, we should open the windows and let fresh air come in. But then he says we should get away from air conditioning, which I think would be something like a conceptual notion, that we should get away from air conditioning if we want to take part in the reality of nature. And part of this also is that at this point, there's no barrier between us and the world. We fully let go on the Vajrayana level, which is interesting because in the next section, he talks about protecting the mind. There are different terms for the Vajrayana. Sometimes it's called the Mantrayana. And that directly relates to the notion of mind protection. And he says, maintaining our existence this way is a form of protecting the mind, ensuring our mind doesn't create any unusual leak. And he says in regard to this protecting that it's not holding back. So it's not a question of repression. It's not a question of withdrawal, but simply maintaining ourselves intact. Simply similar to what we talked about in the Shambhala teachings, holding our seat, being able to rest in our awareness and being fully present, that we're maintaining our existence in the teachings. And this is how, interestingly enough, we protect our mind, not by creating barriers or walls, but by simply resting in awareness and not grasping at experience in any way. And with this, he says, we're not talking about protecting cognitive mind. And he says the cognitive mind picks and chooses, pushes away things that we like and don't like, and keeps the things that we do like. So it's this kind of picking and choosing, like and dislike, that creates struggle, that creates agitation, creates entire storylines, and on a world level creates horrific things like invasions of other countries. But if we cease to do that, if we really can let go of cognitive mind, the conceptual mind, and all the habitual patterns, reference points, all of the things that through which we judge ourselves and judge the world. If we cease to do that, he says, then we really have our mind back. So the idea of mind protection is more like having mind than protecting mind, because mind is not regarded as an obstacle. We're not warding off, he says, we're not warding off protections or dangers, but we're just maintaining our mind. We're really resting in stabilizing our mindfulness awareness with having mind. Well, I think one of the things that makes this section perhaps a little confusing is, and I'm aware of this because of some teachings I attended recently, that in Tibetan, there are a lot of different words for mind. And what we're really talking about here in terms of protecting mind is, our true nature, our fundamental awareness, our inherent intelligence, as he said, just a little further back in the chapter. As opposed to conceptual mind, as opposed to sem, mind that creates the duality, mind that projects other. Anyway, he goes on to say, if mind is protected, when we speak, we're not misunderstood. And this is, again, because mind and body are synchronized and speech is synchronized. So there's precision and skillfulness, as opposed to the kind of clumsiness that comes out of lack of awareness, speed, distraction. He says, mind consists of this is a whole description of all the different possibilities of mind. Mind consists of wise, confused, or neutral thoughts, anything that moves, flips, interprets, goes into a deeper world. Mind appreciates and has tremendous understanding. It has passion and aggression. It can destroy you and also has incredible generosity, which allows you to let go and appreciate non-duality and emptiness. He says that is the description of mind. And the Vajrayana teachings protect all those faculties and possibilities so you can use them all. The idea, he says, is that your intelligence should be preserved within your capability rather than babbling around or just smoozing. And here again, he says, we're talking about two things at once, how to be ourselves and how not to be ourselves, which again, how to recognize and rest in, be true to our fundamental nature, our inherent awareness, our Buddha nature, our insight, our awareness, whatever you want to call it, bodhicitta. That would be how to be ourselves. And how not to be ourselves is letting go of all of the confusion and passion, aggression, and ignorance. Actually, on the Vajrayana level, it's not, whereas one difference you could say between the Hinayana and the Vajrayana in particular is that in the Vajrayana, we actually learn to work with passion, aggression, and ignorance, not in the sense of indulging, but in the sense of seeing their true nature, the wisdom, the sanity that exists within our confusion, which is kind of confusing, but becomes clearer, I think, as we move through some of this material. So that nothing is avoided in the Vajrayana, nothing is rejected outright, but that doesn't mean that we indulge either. It just means that we're able to look into the true nature of our experience in a way that's different, but that is based on the foundation that we develop in the Hinayana and Mahayana. So, and that's what he means. We're learning to be ourselves and how not to be ourselves, letting go and not letting go at the same time, which is quite exciting. And with this, he just, in the next section, he says just a little bit about Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, or discipline, meditation, and knowledge. It says with Shila, or discipline, and with this, he shares quite a bit about the nature of his own training and how forceful, being pinched, punished, big scenes about how to behave, but that he feels good about his education, no resentment. And I think this is because he developed an understanding that his teachers were presenting to him the truth, and that it was for his own benefit, but also for the benefit of all sentient beings. And so, although it was difficult and challenging, he feels good about his education, no resentment. And he goes on to say that, and again, in regard to discipline, that we've been trying to shield off life for so long and trying to be polite, that we see pain as ugly and gross and keep trying to avoid it, which is somewhat of a problem. But that with discipline, what we're actually willing to face facts directly, properly, even willing to face our own gross states of mind. He says we have to learn to face facts rather than seeing the world through rose-tinted glasses. And he says discipline has to become the naked discipline of reality. With true discipline, there's no such thing as getting outside of the dharmic environment, whatever we might be doing. Samadhi, very simply, he says, is meditation practice. Wherever you are, meditation practice is always the key point. We can always come back. We can always wake up. It may be easier to recognize our awake nature, may be more apparent to us in sitting meditation, but we actually can wake up at any time. And then finally, for prajna, he says for discipline and meditation to take place properly, we have to have intelligence. So we're back again to the Vajra mind, our inherent intelligence, our discriminating awareness wisdom. And in this case, he again uses the analogy of building a house, but that we can't just have a box, that we're going to have different rooms, bathrooms, and so on. And we can't just drill holes because it might hurt the plumbing or electricity. We can't just dictate situations in that way, that we actually need to have some intelligence about what we're doing, some intelligence about who we are. And with this, he says, and practicing Dharma comes naturally, that it's free from hassle, brings a lot of health. He says, as you practice more and more, it grows in your bones. It becomes natural. And he compares it to being like a horse that's used to being ridden. The horse actually likes the idea rather than being resentful. He says that's why we sometimes call practice riding the mind. He says survival might be important to us, but survival is based on the state of mind. And when mind is healthier, then synchronizing body and mind becomes natural, and we experience greater health, greater sanity. The last part of this text really goes a lot into the nature of Vajrayana lineage and the legend of the first Vajrayana teachings. And I think this in some ways reflects back to what he said in the beginning about distrust, that we should understand that the Vajrayana teachings are very old, that they weren't invented later, that they weren't developed by people who couldn't practice monasticism. That the Buddha taught Mahayana near the end of his life. And when he did, he asked the Hinayana students who weren't ready and receptive to leave. And then he did the same thing again with his Mahayana students when presenting the Vajrayana. And that the first Vajrayana teachings were often presented to kings, Indian kings, who, including the first king of Shambhala. So we did read about this in the Shambhala text, who said, I can't give up my kingdom. Is there a way to practice that would not involve giving up my kingdom? And so if you remember, he sent his monks and people out of the room and then taught the king Tantra, Vajrayana, particularly the Kala Chakra, to Dala Sangpo. And so the Buddha in the last years of his life, Rinpoche says, taught Vajrayana in the last years of his life and predicted that its Vajrayana would flourish 500 years later. Well, a little more than that was the section on the introduction of Vajrayana into Tibet. And he goes through some of the lineage of the early kings of Tibet who invited teachers to Tibet, including Trisong Detsen, who invited Padmasambhava, who's sometimes called the second Buddha. He talks a little bit about a debate between a Chinese master and an Indian master. And by the way, there's a summary of that debate in the appendix of this book, if you're interested in reading, on page 769. But basically, it was a debate between gradual path versus sudden awakening. And as he says, Vajrayana really involves both. But if you want to read, there's a 2-page summary at the end of this text. And he ends by talking about having respect for the lineage altogether. That what we're discussing is he says, nothing of an extraordinary nature, but a twist that exists in realizing the phenomenal world in its own light and its own perspective. So it's a kind of twist in realizing the phenomenal world in its own light and its own perspective. And I think he makes that statement because it's so different from how we ordinarily experience things. We ordinarily experience things from the point of view of our light, which can be quite dim, and we don't experience things as they are. But when we're able to let go of ego fixation, when we're able to be basically tamed in terms of how we relate to our own minds, when we're able to let go of thinking of ourselves first without considering the needs and suffering of others, then perhaps we can begin to see the world in its own light, in its own perspective. We begin to see things as they are, not from an ego-oriented point of view. He says, by entering the Vajrayana, we're actually getting ourselves into the enlightened side of this particular world. We're hearing more of the teachings of Lord Buddha, who should be greatly admired and respected. And he says the same respect is due lineage holders. They work so hard for us to the extent of sacrificing their comfort and lives. And we should realize that for the masters in the lineage who preceded us, Tilopa, Naropa, Marpa, Milarepa, particularly Milarepa, Gempopa, and so on, all the way up to the present day. The teachers who were forced out of Tibet, lost their country, and have had to rebuild and do what they can to maintain the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. We should realize that this did take immense time, space, and dedication to present the Vajrayana teachings. And as he says, considering how few people work for a greater vision, it's a very moving feeling to realize how these people have worked with genuine compassion. And the chapter ends with him talking about the last words from his own teacher, Jamgon Kongtrul Sechen, about how he'd grown old, that there was all this political upheaval in Tibet, and that he didn't think he could manage. So he says, I leave it up to you people to handle these situations. And as Trungpa Rinpoche says, he wonders what portion of his intention, Jamgon Kongtrul's intention, was directed toward filling me, Chogyam Trungpa, with sadness for the lack of a contemplative tradition in Buddhism. And what portion was because he wanted me to carry on as his heir, his offshoot. It was very sad and happy at the same time. I could weep, cry, or I could dance and explore. And that seems to be the feeling of the Vajrayana, actually. It's both at the same time. So that's where the chapter ends. And it's quite a bit of material. It's a lengthy chapter. And as I say, it was put together from several different talks in which Trungpa Rinpoche introduced the Vajrayana for the first time at each seminary. But we could have some time now for questions and discussion, and anything people want to share, anything in the chapter that either resonated for people, confused people, whatever there might be. Laura?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the difference between Buddha nature that we've talked about in the Mahayana and Vajra mind.
In some ways, it's different terms are used to describe different experiences at different points on the path. But what it really gets at partly is a difference between Mahayana and Vajrayana, in that with Mahayana, we talk about Buddha nature is like an essence, or Tathagata Garbha is the something that we have, whereas Vajra mind is it's like we are Buddha, or we have Buddha within us in a fully developed sense. And that Vajra mind is considered indestructible, not because it's something that's so hard or unbreakable like a bar of iron or something, but more because the more we look at the nature of awareness, the more we realize that from moment to moment, it's never affected in its basic nature by anything we experience. It can be colored by experience, but it's not ever fundamentally changed in any way. So that's what it's indestructible in that sense. If that was not the case, then we would experience something and we'd just be that way forever. And that's another thing we discover in meditation, which we're changing all the time. It sometimes feels like we'll be a certain way forever, very angry and always be, or depressed or whatever it might be. But at a certain point that wears out. And what remains is just the awareness of whatever it is we're experiencing.
That's beautiful. Would you say that Buddha nature is more experienced as a potential?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yes, that would be a good way to put it. It's a potential, or it's like the it's like the seed, sort of like going back to his analogy of planting a field, it's the seed, and it has the potential to become, but with Vajrayana, it's the fully matured, harvestable, usable, whatever kind of crop you can imagine.
I have a question. There was a mention in there of like being intoxicated by the Vajrayana, and I kind of have a sense of, or I relate that to like having a sense of wonder. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think of it as being energized, or I think if you just think about experience in meditation practice, where all of us, we may be very speedy, very caught up, and at a certain point, we're able to, settle ourselves. And at a certain point, suddenly the things around us become just a little bit more vivid, a little more fresh. I think that's like maybe a small sense of what that kind of intoxication means. It's just experiencing the immediacy, the vividness and freshness of the world. And the immediacy and vividness and freshness of our minds, right, which in the end are one and the same thing. But I tend to think of it as being energizing. But we all have our own ways of experiencing that.
Thanks. Steve, I think, has a question.
Yes, could you expand on discriminating awareness? I'm not totally sure I understand that term.
Okay, sometimes it's used as another word for prajna, or another term for prajna. But the basic idea is that we're able to, even on a Hinayana level, see things precisely and see things just as they are, so that we're able to discriminate, not in the sense of the negative sense of discrimination, but just that we're very clear on what's what, that and we're not as confused or driven, or whatever word you want to use, by whatever overlay we have of things. So our tendency to like and dislike. So it's kind of funny. In one sense, it's discriminating, but you could say in another way, it's not discriminating at all in the sense of conceptual mind. But we're talking about the very precise possibility of perception, not in an effortful way, but with a sense of accuracy and precision, and without the confusion of a lot of conceptual overlay.
Right.
Very direct perception, and direct understanding as well.
Great, thank you.
Or at least that's how I understand it. Mark?
Hi. A great talk, and it's very interesting getting into the beginning of this. And this, I may be way out there in this, but to me, well, again, how we've been described things with the previous book, and then there was a description here about the Hinayana, all the yanas, and how it sounds to me like one is not any more or less valuable than the other. The Hinayana being the base of our understanding, basically. I mean, he didn't describe it as the floor or anything, but it's they were describing a house, and you build the house for being the Mahayana but it's not for you, it's for others, because the Mahayana is about teaching and about opening yourself up to help others on the path. And is the Vajrayana really more about the magical aspects of our world?
I think that's one way. Well, I guess it depends what you mean by magical aspects. So maybe I'll ask you that.
Well, like, how do two things can exist at the same time that might be completely opposed to each other? I think we see this come up. Emptiness is emptiness, and yet it is everything that we experience as well. It's full and it's empty at the same time. Those type of things. Is it kind of an understanding of that, or not really?
No, I think that would be part of it. It's
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I haven't put a lot of thought into this. I really shouldn't have brought it up, but I just thought I would talk about it anyway.
Might be better if we don't put a lot of thought into it, actually, because
I like that.
Because emptiness is beyond concept, is what we're told. So that means
Space is beyond concept.
So anyway, space is beyond concept. Anything that we try to do to define it is maybe close, may help point to it, but it's not exactly it. And even in the Hinayana teachings, if you get into Abhidharma and some of the study of logic, which will drive you nuts because it'll turn your mind into a pretzel. But they start right away by saying that every conceptual mind is mistaken in some way. And so anything we say about, now some are clearer than others, but they're all mistaken in that we mistake the concept for the thing.
Now, is the Vajrayana path, is that part of this, that trying to understand that which we can't really understand?
It's trying to cut through any attempt to understand, I think is probably the way to put it. Right. So there's a lot, like there are different practices that, I think we talked about this a little bit last week, but there are practices that are fairly elaborate, but at some point there's also always just a letting go into simple being. I mean, it's not so different than what we do when we do meditation practice. But it is different in some ways too. So I'm not gonna.
Oh, okay. But I know Anam Thumptum talks about, he describes things at the beginning of one of his books that I've spoken about before, and he just calls it the great unknowable. Like, don't waste your time with it. He even says, don't even bother with it. So maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I was thinking when I started that I would say I'm not going to pretend that I understand everything about the Vajrayana, but now I'll start pretending. But I decided that probably wasn't a good way to start. But it would be honest. There's some things I get and some things I don't. And there are things that I thought I got. And then, like he says in this talk, you go back and forth quite a bit. And how I think, for instance, of the Mahayana is really different than when I, first encountered those teachings. I think, I always liked the idea of working for others and being a benefit to others and trying to make the world, a better place and so on. But at some point, I actually came to see that if, the idea of Hinayana as self-liberation, that's, the goal of that. Actually, what the Mahayana is presenting is also self-liberation, in the sense that if we can't see the world with compassion and love and gentleness, that there's no way we can be completely liberated.
Right.
That there's always, it's like the experience people have of going on retreat, or I expect living in a monastery where you do settle and you orderly life. Then you go out in the world and you encounter all kinds of things. The Mahayana teachings make it possible for us to be in the world in a more awake way. And as he said that in this talk, he said something like, we build something for others and for ourselves at the same time.
Right.
And
I like that.
But that's not how I would have, if you'd asked me about the Mahayana, I don't know how many years ago, but sometime back, I don't know if I would have said it quite that way, but at some point I came to see, no, it really is essential. And that's what the teachings say, that without compassion, the Vajrayana is not possible. And I think it's because precisely that we are unable to, without love and compassion, we can't relate to it's difficult to relate to the world without ego. We're going to inject ego somehow.
Right.
We're going to inject our agenda, our whatever. So at least
thank you.
Again, my understanding.
I'll probably mangle this, but just adding on to what you're just saying, Michael, about and the Vajrayana needing love and compassion to relate to the world. I think you put it that way. And then I thought of the title of the book that maybe it's descriptive of the Vajrayana, is In Love with the World.
Yeah, that's Mingyur Rinpoche's book. Yeah, it's very good. I really enjoyed that book in part because he's talking about his experiences being in the world and working with, you know, some of the things we've studied in terms of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. But it's very much in the world, his experiences, and, you know, really admire him for the retreat, that wandering retreat that he did. And definitely, you know, when we talk about that, I think as Trungpa Rinpoche said here, that it's not based on holding back. The wandering retreat is a great example of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that we're in love with the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, Lodro?
Thank you, Michael. That was a beautiful presentation. My question is, I was wondering if you personally had any chance to attend any of the talks that, or any of the seminaries that are included in anything in the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma, or if you had a chance to ever see Chogyam Trungpa in person. I was wondering how it affected the room, the atmosphere, and how the experience was, experientially, how it was for you.
I attended the 1982 seminary, and I actually recognized some parts of this chapter from, you know, the especially when he talks about the lineage, and not the lineage and some mistaken ideas that people have had about the Vajrayana, you know, that it was invented later and that it did not come from the Buddha and so on. That was directly from 1982 seminary. So what can I say about the atmosphere he created was very powerful. I think I always found it hard to come up with even a question because it seemed very clear that you just did what he said. It was very clear that you just, you know, he's told us how to practice. He's told us how to, you know, it was just a question of actually going out and doing it. Later on, I'd have questions, but in his presence, it was hard to think that way. You know, he could be scary sometimes. I don't know how else to put it. But I also, you know, had tremendous love for him. What else can I say? And it was interesting in seminary altogether how the atmosphere changed through the three yanas and how that came about, what that was from. You know, was it him? Was it the practice, the study? I don't know. The Hinayana really did feel kind of tight, not necessarily in a bad way, but, and then the Mahayana was, felt much more open and loose in a certain way, not loose in a carousing way, but just loose in the sense of more openness, more space. And then the Vajrayana overall, it was just, as I say, really energizing. That's the only way, that's how I experienced it. But, you know, it was different. I mean, he also had an incredible sense of humor. The first few times that I heard him talk, I couldn't understand anything he was saying, hardly. But what drew me to him was how he answered. He took questions and answers, and how his answers seemed so incredibly tuned to the person who was asking. It's the only way I can describe it. And you could hear it in how people responded. You know, a person would ask a question with a great deal of anxiety, and you could hear them, you could feel the relaxation in what they said afterward, or whatever. It wasn't any one thing, but it was a very powerful atmosphere that he created, very much an atmosphere of awake.
That's beautiful. I was precisely thinking, because for us in the Sangha, we can definitely discuss the Hinayana, we can discuss the Mahayana. Going into the Vajrayana, it seems that the experiential aspect, it's so important for us to feel these teachings, not there can be so much value into debate or into sharing our ideas, tuning into the lineage and tuning in an emotional way to it is something that I've always been very curious about. So I'm glad that you shared that. Thank you.
I think the most important thing we have is our meditation practice and being able to work with that. You know, that I used to joke when I do introductory talks at the local center that every talk was really about meditation, and that the basic idea was we should do this, that it's actually helpful, that it actually will make a difference for us if we do the practice. And as he says, if we practice regularly, which is important, then it becomes easier. Maybe not every time, but it becomes easier. Jane?
I have a hypothetical question. Let's say one has moments at some point down the road along the path of experiencing what is described here, moments of being in a place that is very close to this perfect Vajrayana state. Is one still heir to anxiety, depression, all the negative feelings that come and go in real world experience?
I think so.
Yes. Yeah, you think so? Could you say more? I mean, you really understand my question, right? Because I'm struggling with that. Whole concept is difficult for me.
Well, there's a couple things to that. First thing is that one thing that happens with meditation practice is that we begin to settle. We begin paying more attention to our experience in a different way. And I think particularly in the beginning, but it can happen at other points, sometimes we become more aware of our anxiety or confusion or whatever. And sometimes in the beginning, people, even say, sometimes it feels like meditation made things worse. But what actually happened is we're beginning to become aware of how we are all the time. It's like, when you have like a lot of noise in the house and then you turn like the TV off and suddenly you hear things that you weren't able to hear before because you're not as distracted. So I think sometimes that happens with practice. But then the other thing is that we have, at least in my experience, we have glimpses, moments where we really see that there's this possibility of, wakefulness. And in my experience, the more we practice, the more those occur, or maybe more accurately, the more able we are to recognize them and relax into them. But other times we grasp and try to hold on because, sometimes they're very positive, they're experiences that can feel good. There can be a real sense of well-being. But as soon as we try to grasp and hold on to it, then we're into something else. So that's why if, go back to the Path of Individual Liberation, the first book, the Hinayana book, where Trungpa Rinpoche talks about Vipassana, and he says the real practice of Vipassana is disowning, because we're so tempted to try to hold on to experiences. But actually what allows us to sustain awareness is letting go, oddly enough. And it takes practice and training to do that. So I think over time, there's, less confusion, less anxiety. But it's not like, at least in my experience, it's not like, taking a pill and then it's gone forever. It's, there's a path of wearing it out, letting it go.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Maybe other people would, have something to say about that.
It's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
I would say that in my experience, things like anxiety, different kinds of kleshas, emotions, occur, but my experience of them is very different.
That's a good
Can you,
point.
can you say more about that, Barry? How is it different?
It's easier for me to not take them so seriously,
Ah, ah,
and they're just usually not as sticky, you know? It's like, some of these emotional upheavals can, I would feel like they actually kind of sunk their hooks into me, you know?
right.
Um, I don't have that kind of experience. I mean, that has changed,
Mm-hmm.
and more and more. I always relate it back to the very elementary, the beginning of it all, when you training your mind when thoughts arrive to return your attention to the object of meditation. And to me, I can have a similar response to emotional experience. I can see it like, oh yeah, look at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm
glad
not
you said
saying that that's like I'm just perfectly above it all now by any means,
Yeah, right.
but it doesn't. I don't get as hooked as I once did.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Barry.
That's
I'm glad you said
helpful.
that.
Yeah, that makes a tremendous amount of sense. And that's good news. Something to look forward.
Yeah, hang in there.
Okay.
Or
Well,
as,
that's why regular practice is important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have 2 cents to put in here too.
Great.
I think in the Vajrayana, this is a little more conceptual, my understanding more than my experience, but in the Vajrayana, there's a letting go into the energy of our emotions so that they become the fuel. And there's we're not trying to get rid of them for sure, that they help us, they get transformed into enlightened wisdom. So when we go into the Buddha families, we can specifically see, we'll study more the enlightened wisdom states.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Transformed.
Yeah, just to tie it back into what we read, I think what Barry described is exactly what Trungpa Rinpoche meant when he said we just see these things as little ripples on the pond.
Uh-huh.
Before we think it's the whole thing.
Right, right, right. Thank you. It's helpful. So they don't really take over. Is that what you're saying? They don't take over. You can keep them at a distance.
more of the time, yeah.
Yeah, you can see them happening.
We can feel the qualities of them without, as Barry said, totally believing in them and being with the energy of it, which is probably feels like a little distance compared to how normally get lost.
Right, right, some distance. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I found that emotional experience frequently, if I'm in good shape, I can look at the physical experience of it, just where it is in the body, how it feels, and start to become aware that there's that, which is like energy, which is more like what Laura was talking about. And then there's all the thoughts about it and the explanation and justification for why it's right for me to be feeling this, or all of that stuff, right? But if you just look at the physical experience of it and really experience the energy, and to the extent you're able to just let go all of the chatter, then it really becomes something else.
Okay.
Miriam?
Yeah, I was going to say this is all very wise. And my first thought around anxiety and depression is that, you know, they're always related to a sense of threat about the self, a sense of being mistreated, again, involving the self, or negative beliefs about the self, or being abandoned. Like, it's very much like I see these as cliches or emotions that really involve the entrapment of the self, and it's very hard to loosen that grip. But like others have said, I find that you can like go much more easily when you don't take the thoughts seriously. Or one thing I've observed recently is that sometimes it's easier than others. And when I'm sleep deprived, it's like I can't resist the depressive tone of my fatigue. It's like all of a sudden the interpretation of the fatigue turns into something which looks more like depression rather than just fatigue. And I caught this the last time and I realized, oh, I'm just sleep deprived. It's a little harder for me to understand this differently. And so I think all the insights, and going back to the Vajrayana, I see it as a way of living. And what does this look like in action? And I still have some doubt about the euphoria or some of the intense positive emotions, although I can understand how they might come. But so I still have some doubt about some of the benefits, which are made out to be quite intense. But, I'm not close to anything. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're just in the introduction, and this is a very thick book. So there's a lot more to come. I measured it, it's 3 inches thick.
Oh, Karen Sue.
So when Barry, when you mentioned about the stickiness of these experiences and that they become less sticky, boy, does that really resonate with me, because like stickiness meaning they stick on to me, and that's a whole almost visceral feeling about I get caught in them, they're on me, they're stuck on me, and I can't get them off. But when they're less sticky, that quality of emotion, thought, experience, it's not, I know I'm just repeating what you said, but it's not sticking on me. And that's been for me a huge relief and aha moment, that something that previously would have really stuck to me isn't stuck to me anymore. And and to Jane, to your point, it's still there, but it's not stuck. And that's just been so powerful for me. And Barry, I thank you for really clearly I mean, I finally got it. It's just, it's really wonderful. So I thank you.
Karen Sue, thank you for that transmission of stickiness.
Yeah. Sometimes I remember people would talk about identifying with a thought and learning not to identify with a thought, which is maybe just another way of understanding the same thing. When we start saying, this is me, this is real, as opposed to this is just one more passing thing.
We're almost out of time, and I'm wondering if there's anyone else who would like to have something to offer or question or.
Philip?
So I want to say, Michael, thank you so much for this talk. It's just a wonderful synthesis and overview and introduction. And as regards what we're just talking about, sometimes I find it helpful to look at what is experiencing this. You know, it's sort of like who is experiencing it and where are you experiencing it? But if you think in terms of what is experiencing this, and just search for it, and just search for what is experiencing this.
Okay, well, we'll close with the prayer for peace and dedicating the merit generated through our practice and study for benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Michael. Tomorrow night.
Michael, thank you.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Thank you, Michael and Barry.
Be well.
Bye. Thanks.
Michael. Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody, good night.
Good.